what would reasonable terms look like? Margaret asked. Well, the lawyer said market rate rent for a 4-bedroom house in your neighborhood would be about $3,000 per month. Margaret almost laughed. Michael and Jessica had been living rent-free for 3 years, saving approximately $108,000 in housing costs. Now they would be faced with paying market rate rent or finding somewhere else to live. If you're enjoying this story, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. The next morning, Margaret met with her lawyer and signed all the necessary documents to transfer her house to the Margaret Thompson Family Trust. She was now the sole trustee and beneficiary of a trust that owned her home. Congratulations, Mrs. Thompson, the lawyer said. You now have complete control over your living situation. When Margaret returned home, she found Michael and Jessica in the kitchen making lunch for the children. Michael, Jessica, Margaret said, I need to speak with both of you. What about Mom? Michael asked. I have some news about the house, Margaret said, pulling out the trust documents. What kind of news? Jessica asked suspiciously. I've transferred ownership of this house to a family trust, Margaret announced. Michael and Jessica stared at her in confusion. What does that mean? Michael asked. It means, Margaret explained, that I no longer personally own this house. The Margaret Thompson Family Trust owns it, and I am the trustee. But that doesn't change anything, Jessica said. We still have residency rights? Actually, Margaret said with a smile, it changes everything. You establish residency in a house owned by Margaret Thompson. This house is now owned by the Margaret Thompson Family Trust. Your residency rights don't transfer to the new owner. The color drained from Michael's face as he began to understand the implications. Mom, you can't do that, he said. I already did it, Margaret replied. The trust is now the legal owner of this property, and as trustee, I have the authority to make decisions about who can live here. But we're family, Jessica protested. Yes, Margaret agreed. And as family, you're welcome to sign a lease agreement with the trust and pay market rate rent to continue living here. Market rate rent? Michael asked. $3,000 per month, Margaret said. Plus utilities. Michael and Jessica looked at each other in shock. They had been living rent-free for 3 years. And now they were being asked to pay $36,000 per year in rent. Mom, we can't afford $3,000 a month, Michael said. Then I suppose you'll need to find somewhere else to live, Margaret replied calmly. But Mom, Jessica said, what about the kids? What about their schools? You should have thought about that before you tried to steal my house, Margaret said firmly. We weren't trying to steal your house, Michael protested. Really? Margaret asked. Then why did you steal my property documents? Why did you research tenant rights? Why did you offer me half the market value for my home and threaten to make my life difficult if I refused? Michael and Jessica had no answer for these questions. You have 30 days to decide, Margaret continued. You can sign a lease agreement and pay market rate rent, or you can find somewhere else to live. Those are your only options. And if we refuse, Jessica asked defiantly, then the trust will begin formal eviction proceedings, Margaret replied. And since you have no legal claim to a property owned by the trust, the eviction will be swift and final. Margaret could see the defeat in Michael and Jessica's faces. Their carefully planned scheme to acquire her house had backfired spectacularly. "Moo," Michael said quietly. "How could you do this to us?" "Michael," Margaret replied sadly, "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourselves. I offered you a home when you needed help, and you repaid my generosity by trying to steal my property." "We weren't trying to steal anything," Jessica said weakly. Margaret said, "You offered me $150,000 for a house worth over $300,000, then threatened to make my life difficult if I refused. You stole my property documents. You researched legal ways to prevent me from removing you from my own home. What would you call that?" Jessica had no response. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house was tense, but different. Michael and Jessica seemed to realize that their position was hopeless. They began looking at rental properties and discussing their options in hushed tones. "Grandma Maggie," little Emma said one afternoon, "are we really going to move away?" "That depends on what your parents decide, sweetheart," Margaret replied gently. Margaret felt sorry for her grandchildren, who were innocent victims of their parents' greed and manipulation, but she also knew that she couldn't allow Michael and Jessica to continue taking advantage of her generosity. 2 weeks later, Michael approached Margaret with a different attitude than she had seen from him in months. "Mom," he said quietly, "Jessica and I have been talking, and we want to apologize." "Apologize? For what?" Margaret asked. "For everything," Michael said. "For trying to pressure you into selling the house, for taking your documents, for treating you badly in your own home." Margaret looked at her son and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine remorse. "Michael," she said, "I appreciate the apology, but apologies don't undo the damage that's been done." "I know," Michael said, "but we're hoping that maybe we can work something out." "What kind of something?" Margaret asked. "We found a rental house that we can afford," Michael explained. "It's smaller than this place, but it's nice, and it's in the same school district. We're planning to move there next month." Margaret was surprised. "You're moving out voluntarily?" "Yes," Michael said. "We realize that we can't afford to pay market rate rent here. And we also realize that we've damaged our relationship with you. We think it's best if we give you your space back." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She was glad to be getting her house back, but she was heartbroken that her relationship with her son had deteriorated to this point. "What about the children?" Margaret asked. "Will I still be able to see them?" "Of course," Michael said. "Mom, despite everything that's happened, you're still their grandmother. We want them to have a relationship with you." "And what about us?" Margaret asked. "Can we repair our relationship?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I hope so," he said finally. "I know I've made some terrible mistakes, and I know it will take time to earn your trust back. But I'd like to try, if you're willing." Margaret looked at her son and saw the boy she had raised, the young man she had been proud of, the adult she had helped through his own difficult times. Despite everything that had happened, he was still her son. "I'm willing to try," Margaret said, "but things will have to be different. I can't have you living in my house again, and I need to know that you respect my decisions about my own property." Understand," Michael said. "And Mom, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you handled this situation. You were stronger and smarter than I gave you credit for." Margaret smiled sadly. Michael, I've been strong and smart for 60 years. You just never bothered to notice. 3 months later, Margaret lives peacefully in her own home. She found a part-time job that she enjoys, and her financial situation is stable. Michael and Jessica live in their rental house with the children, and while their relationship with Margaret is still healing, they visit regularly, and the grandchildren spend weekends with their grandmother. Margaret never changed her will back. To include Michael as her heir, the house will still go to the trust when she dies, with instructions that it be sold and the proceeds donated to charity. Some lessons, Margaret told her friend one day, are too important to undo. What do you think? Did Margaret do the right thing? Should children who try to take advantage of their parents face consequences? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible family drama stories that will make you think about what really matters in life. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, but sometimes standing up for yourself is the only way to earn the respect you deserve. That evening, Margaret confronted Michael about the missing documents. Michael, she said, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. What is it, Mom? Michael replied, but his tone was guarded. Someone took my property documents from my filing cabinet, Margaret said. Do you know anything about that? Michael's expression didn't change. No, Mom. I don't know anything about your documents. Michael, please, Margaret pleaded. If you took 'em, just give 'em back. We can work this out. Mom, I told you I don't know anything about your documents, Michael repeated. Maybe you misplaced them. Margaret knew her son was lying. She had kept those documents in the same place for 20 years, and they had never been misplaced before. Michael, Margaret said sadly, what have you become? I've become a man who's trying to protect his family, Michael replied coldly. That night, Margaret barely slept. She couldn't believe that her own son would steal her property documents. But she was beginning to realize that the Michael she had raised no longer existed. The man living in her house was a stranger who was willing to do anything to get what he wanted. The next morning, Margaret met with her lawyer and spent the day at the county recorder's office obtaining copies of all her documents. Fortunately, no fraudulent filings had been made, but the lawyer warned her to be vigilant. Mrs. Thompson, the lawyer said, I think you need to consider the possibility that your son and daughter are planning something more serious than just pressuring you to sell. What do you mean? Margaret asked. I mean, the lawyer replied, that stealing property documents is often the first step in attempting to fraudulently transfer ownership of real estate. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Her own son was potentially planning to steal her house. When Margaret returned home that afternoon, she found Michael and Jessica in the kitchen having what appeared to be a serious conversation. They stopped talking abruptly when she entered. Mom, Jessica said with false brightness, how was your day? Interesting, Margaret replied. I spent the day getting copies of all my property documents from the county recorder's office. Margaret watched as Michael and Jessica exchanged a quick glance. Why did you need to do that? Michael asked. Because Margaret said, looking directly at her son, the originals were stolen from my filing cabinet. That's terrible, Jessica said, but her tone lacked any genuine concern. "Do you think someone broke into the house?" "No," Margaret replied. "I think someone who lives in this house took them." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael and Jessica stared at Margaret, and she stared back, waiting for one of them to confess. "Mom," Michael said finally, "are you accusing us of stealing your documents?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Margaret replied. "I'm simply stating facts. My documents are missing, and only people who live in this house had access to them." "Well, it wasn't us," Jessica said defensively. Margaret nodded slowly. "I see. Well, just so you know, I now have copies of all the documents, and my lawyer has advised me to keep them in a safe deposit box." Margaret could see the frustration in Michael and Jessica's faces. Whatever they had been planning to do with the stolen documents would no longer be possible. "Mom," Michael said, "I think you're being paranoid." "Why would we want your documents?" "I don't know, Michael," Margaret replied. "Why would you?" That evening, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She realized that she could no longer trust her son and daughter, and she needed to protect herself and her property. She also realized that there was one crucial fact that Michael and Jessica had overlooked in all their scheming and planning, a fact that would soon turn their world upside down and give Margaret the upper hand in this terrible situation. We left Margaret Thompson realizing that her son Michael and daughter-in-law Jessica had stolen her property documents and were potentially planning to fraudulently claim ownership of her house. But Margaret had discovered something that would completely change the balance of power in this situation that evening. As Margaret sat in her bedroom reviewing the copies of her documents that she had obtained from the county recorder's office, she noticed something that made her smile for the first time in weeks. Among the papers was a document that Michael and Jessica had apparently overlooked when they stole her files. A document that proved something very important about the ownership of the house. The next morning, Margaret called her lawyer. "Mr. Davidson," she said, "I need to ask you about something I found in my property records." "What is it, Mrs. Thompson?" The lawyer replied, "There's a document here that shows my late husband added a specific clause to our deed before he died," Margaret explained. "It says that in the event of my death, the property cannot be inherited by anyone who is not living in the house as an invited guest rather than as a legal resident." "That's interesting," the lawyer said. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Margaret continued, "that because Michael and Jessica have established legal residency in my home, they have actually disqualified themselves from ever inheriting the property." There was silence on the other end of the line as the lawyer processed this information. "Mrs. Thompson," the lawyer said finally, "are you saying that by claiming tenant rights, your son has legally prevented himself from inheriting your house?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Margaret confirmed. "My husband was a very smart man. He put this clause in the deed to prevent anyone from taking advantage of our hospitality and then claiming ownership of our home." "This changes everything," the lawyer said. "We need to meet immediately to discuss your options." Margaret spent the morning at the lawyer's office reviewing the implications of the clause in her deed. It turned out that David had been even more prescient than Margaret had realized. "Your husband clearly anticipated the possibility that someone might try to establish residency in your home and then claim rights to the property. the lawyer explained. This clause effectively prevents that from happening. So, what are my options now? Margaret asked. Well, the lawyer said, you have several choices. First, you could simply inform your son about this clause and see if that changes his behavior. Second, you could proceed with formal eviction proceedings, knowing that they have no legal claim to the property. Or third, you could take a more creative approach. What kind of creative approach? Margaret asked. The lawyer smiled. You could sell the house. Sell it. Margaret was confused. But I don't want to sell my house. You could sell it to yourself, the lawyer explained. Or more specifically, you could transfer ownership to a trust or LLC that you control. This would effectively reset the legal status of everyone living in the house. Margaret began to understand the implications. So if I transfer the house to a trust, Michael and Jessica would no longer have any residency rights. Correct. The lawyer confirmed they would be living in a property owned by a trust, not by you personally. The trust could then require them to sign a formal lease agreement or ask them to leave. Margaret felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. How quickly could we do this? We could have the paperwork ready by tomorrow, the lawyer said. But Mrs. Thompson, I want to make sure you understand what you're doing. This will permanently change your son's inheritance rights. Mr. Davidson, Margaret said firmly, my son forfeited his inheritance rights when he tried to steal my house and my property documents. I'm not concerned about his inheritance anymore. That afternoon, Margaret returned home to find Michael and Jessica in the living room with what appeared to be real estate documents spread across the coffee table. What's all this? Margaret asked. Oh, just some paperwork, Jessica said, quickly gathering up the documents. But Margaret had seen enough to recognize what they were: property valuation reports, mortgage pre-approval letters, and what looked like a purchase agreement. Michael, Margaret said, are you planning to buy another house? We're exploring our options, Michael replied evasively. Margaret realized that Michael and Jessica were planning to purchase a new home, probably using the equity they expected to gain from acquiring her house at below market value. That's interesting, Margaret said. I'm exploring some options myself. What kind of options? Jessica asked suspiciously. Oh, just some legal and financial matters, Margaret replied. Nothing you need to worry about. That evening, Margaret received a call from her lawyer confirming that all the paperwork was ready for the property transfer to the trust, double quotes, Mrs. Thompson. The lawyer said, once you sign these documents tomorrow, you'll be the sole beneficiary of a trust that owns your house. Your son and daughter-in-law will have no legal claim to the property whatsoever. And then what happens? Margaret asked. Then, the lawyer said, the trust can require them to sign a lease agreement with reasonable terms or ask them to vacate the property. We left Margaret Thompson telling her son Michael and daughter Jessica to leave her house after they threatened her and tried to manipulate her into selling them her home for half its value. Michael's reaction to his mother's demand was not what anyone would expect from a son who had been living rent-free in his mother's home for 3 years. Mom, Michael said, his voice cold and calculated, you can't kick us out. This is my house, Michael. Margaret replied firmly, I absolutely can ask you to leave. Actually, Jessica interjected with a smug smile, You can't. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law with confusion. What do you mean I can't? Michael pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a document. Mom, we've established residency here. We've been living here for 3 years. We receive mail here. The kids are enrolled in school from this address. Legally, you can't just kick us out without proper notice. Margaret stared at the phone screen, trying to understand what she was seeing. What is this? It's information about tenant rights, Jessica explained. Even without a lease, we have rights as residents of this property. Margaret felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Tenant rights. You're not tenant. You're my family. Actually, Mom, Michael said, in the eyes of the law, we are tenants, and you can't evict tenants without following proper legal procedures. Margaret realized that Michael and Jessica had not only planned to acquire her house, but they had also researched how to protect themselves legally if she tried to remove them from the property. So you're telling me, Margaret said slowly, that I can't ask you to leave my own house, not without going through the proper legal channels, Jessica confirmed, which could take months. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair. Her own son was using legal technicalities to remain in her home against her wishes. Michael, Margaret said, her voice breaking, how can you do this to me? I'm your mother. Mom, you're being unreasonable, Michael replied without any apparent emotion. We made you a fair offer for the house, and you rejected it. Now you're trying to kick us out of spite. Margaret was incredulous. Michael, you offered me half the value of my home and threatened to make my life difficult if I refused. How is that a fair offer? It's fair considering the circumstances. Jessica said, you're unemployed, you're getting older, and you can't maintain this property on your own. Margaret looked at these two people who had been living in her home, eating her food, and benefiting from her generosity for 3 years. And she barely recognized them as human beings, let alone family. So what happens now? Margaret asked. Now, Michael said, we continue living here while you think about our offer. And hopefully you'll come to your senses and realize that selling us the house is the best option for everyone. And if I don't? Margaret asked. Jessica smiled coldly. Then we'll continue to exercise our rights as residents of this property. Margaret realized that Michael and Jessica were essentially holding her hostage in her own home. They were using legal technicalities to prevent her from removing them while simultaneously pressuring her to sell them the house. I can't believe you're doing this to me, Margaret whispered. Mom, we're not doing anything to you, Michael said. We're protecting our family's interests, just like you should be protecting yours. My interests? Margaret asked. Michael, my interest is in keeping my home and living peacefully in it. Your interests seem to be in taking my home away from me. We're not taking anything, Jessica. We're offering to buy it for half its value, Margaret pointed out. For a fair price, considering the circumstances, Michael repeated. Margaret realized that no amount of reasoning would change their minds. Michael and Jessica had decided that they deserved her house, and they were willing to use any means necessary to get it. If you're enjoying this story, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Over the next few days, life in Margaret's house became unbearable. Michael and Jessica acted as if nothing had changed, going about their daily routines while Margaret felt like a prisoner in her own home. They made no effort to look for alternative housing. Instead, they seemed to be settling in even more permanently. Jessica rearranged more furniture. Michael talked about long-term home improvement projects, and they both spoke about the house as if it already belonged to them. "Grandma Maggie," little Emma said one afternoon, "Mommy says we're going to live here forever now." Margaret's heart broke for her grandchildren, who were being used as pawns in their parents' manipulative game. "We'll see, sweetheart," Margaret replied, not wanting to upset the child with the adult conflicts happening around her. Margaret decided to consult with a lawyer to understand her options. She made an appointment with an attorney who specialized in real estate and family law. "Mrs. Thompson," the lawyer explained, "your son is technically correct about the residency issue because they've been living there for 3 years and have established it as their primary residence. You would need to follow formal eviction procedures to remove them." "How long would that take?" Margaret asked. "In Ohio, it could take anywhere from 30 to 90 days, depending on various factors," the lawyer replied. "And that's assuming they don't contest the eviction, which they likely would." "So I'm stuck with them in my house?" Margaret asked. "Not necessarily," the lawyer said. "There are other options we could explore. But first, I need to ask you something important. Do you have documentation proving that you own the house?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "I have the deed, the mortgage documents, everything." "Good," the lawyer said, "because I want to make sure there haven't been any attempts to fraudulently transfer ownership or add names to the deed." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Why would you ask that?" "Because," the lawyer explained, "in cases like this, it's not uncommon for family members to attempt to establish legal claims to property through various means." Margaret left the lawyer's office with a growing sense of dread. She decided to check her important documents to make sure everything was in order. When Margaret arrived home, she went to her bedroom where she kept her important papers in a locked filing cabinet. As she opened the cabinet, her heart stopped. Several documents were missing. The deed to the house was gone. Her mortgage papers were gone. Her insurance policies were missing. Margaret frantically searched through the remaining papers, hoping she had simply misplaced the documents, but they were definitely gone. With shaking hands, Margaret called her lawyer. "Mr. Davidson," she said when he answered, "someone has taken my property documents." "What do you mean taken?" the lawyer asked. "They're gone from my filing cabinet." Margaret explained. "The deed, the mortgage papers, everything. Mrs. Thompson, do you suspect someone in your household took them?" The lawyer asked out. Margaret didn't want to believe it, but there was only one explanation. "I think my son and daughter-in-law took them. We need to act quickly," the lawyer said. "Can you come to my office first thing tomorrow morning? We need to get copies of all your documents from the county recorder's office and make sure no fraudulent filings have been made." "You want to buy my house?" Margaret asked. "We want to offer you a solution that benefits everyone." Michael explained. "You could sell us the house, use the money to buy a nice condo or apartment, and everyone would be happy." "Everyone would be happy?" Margaret questioned. "Michael, this house is worth over $300,000. It's my primary asset, my security, my home." "But Mom," Jessica said, "you don't need a house this big. You're just one person." A nice 2-bedroom condo would be perfect for you. Margaret realized that Michael and Jessica had not only planned this conversation, but had also researched the value of her home and calculated how they could benefit from acquiring it at below market value. What exactly are you proposing? Margaret asked. Michael pulled out another piece of paper. We've done some research. We could offer you $150,000 for the house. Margaret was stunned. $150,000. Michael, this house is worth over $300,000. But, Mom, Jessica explained, you have to consider the costs of selling, realtor fees, closing costs, repairs that would need to be made. Plus, we'd be doing you a favor by buying it quickly without the hassle of listing it. Margaret couldn't believe the audacity of their proposal. They were offering her half the value of her home and presenting it as a favor. And where exactly do you expect me to live? Margaret asked. There are some lovely senior communities in the area, Jessica said brightly. Much more appropriate for someone your age. I'm 60 years old, not 90, Margaret said firmly. I don't need a senior community, Mom, Michael said, his tone becoming more aggressive. You need to be realistic about your situation. You're unemployed. You're getting older. And maintaining this house is becoming too much for you. Says who? Margaret challenged. I've maintained this house perfectly well for 25 years, but you had a job then. Jessica pointed out, now you don't, and at your age, you're unlikely to find another one that pays enough to maintain this lifestyle. Margaret felt like she was being attacked from all sides. Her own son and daughter-in-law were treating her like an elderly woman who needed to be managed rather than the capable homeowner who had provided them with free housing for 3 years. If you're enjoying this story, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. I need time to think about this, Margaret said, hoping to end the conversation. Actually, Mom, Michael said, we need an answer soon. We've already spoken to a lawyer about the best way to handle the transfer of property. Margaret was shocked. You've spoken to a lawyer without consulting me. We wanted to understand our options, Jessica explained. And the lawyer said that given your unemployment and age, it might be difficult for you to qualify for a new mortgage if you wanted to buy another place. Margaret realized that Michael and Jessica had been planning this for weeks, possibly even before she lost her job. They had researched property values, consulted lawyers, and developed a strategy to acquire her home. I can't believe you've been planning this behind my back, Margaret said. Mom, we're trying to help you, Michael insisted. This is the best solution for everyone. The best solution for everyone, or the best solution for you and Jessica? Margaret asked pointedly. Mom, that's not fair, Michael said. We're offering you a way out of a difficult situation. I'm not in a difficult situation, Margaret replied. I lost my job 5 weeks ago. That doesn't mean I need to sell my home and move to a senior community. But Mom, Jessica said, what if you can't find another job? What if your savings run out? What if you get sick? You need to think about these things. Margaret began to see the manipulation tactics clearly. Michael and Jessica were using fear and uncertainty to pressure her into making a decision that would benefit them enormously, while leaving her in a much worse financial position. I think, Margaret said slowly, that you both need to remember that this is my house, and I will make decisions about my property based on what's best for me, not what's convenient for you. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Michael's expression hardened, and Jessica's friendly demeanor disappeared entirely. "Mom," Michael said coldly, "we're trying to be reasonable here. But if you're going to be stubborn about this, we might need to consider other options." "What other options?" Margaret asked. "Well," Jessica said, "we can't continue living here indefinitely if you're going to be difficult about everything. We have our own family to think about." Margaret realized this was a threat. "Are you saying you'll move out if I don't sell you the house?" "We're saying," Michael replied, "that this living arrangement only works if everyone is happy with it. And right now, it's not working." "For whom is it not working?" Margaret asked. "You've been living here rent-free for 3 years. Your children are settled in their schools. You've saved thousands of dollars by not paying rent or mortgage. How exactly is this not working for you?" "It's not working because there's no security," Jessica explained. "We've invested 3 years of our lives in this arrangement, and now you're acting like you can just kick us out whenever you want." Margaret was amazed by Jessica's twisted logic. "You've invested 3 years. Jessica, I've invested 25 years in this house. I've paid the mortgage, maintained the property, and provided you with free housing. What exactly have you invested?" "Our time, our energy, our emotional investment in making this place our home," Jessica replied. "This place is my home," Margaret said firmly. "You are guests in my home." The word guests seemed to trigger something in Michael. His face flushed with anger, and when he spoke, his voice was louder and more aggressive than Margaret had ever heard it. "Guests!" Michael shouted. "Mom, we're not guests. We're your family. We've been taking care of this place, improving it, making it better." "Taking care of it?" Margaret questioned. "Michael, I've continued to pay all the bills, maintain the property, and handle all the responsibilities of homeownership. What exactly have you been taking care of?" "We've been taking care of you," Jessica shouted back, "making sure you're not alone in this big house, providing you with company, helping with household tasks." Margaret realized that Michael and Jessica had completely rewritten the narrative of their living arrangement in their minds. Instead of seeing themselves as beneficiaries of Margaret's generosity, they had convinced themselves that they were doing her a favor by living in her home. "I never asked you to take care of me," Margaret said quietly. "I offered you a place to stay when you needed help. And now you're acting like I owe you something for accepting that help." "Mom," Michael said, his voice becoming dangerously quiet, "we're giving you one last chance to be reasonable about this. Sell us the house for a fair price, and everyone can move on with their lives. And if I refuse..." Margaret asked. Michael and Jessica looked at each other, and Margaret saw something in their expressions that chilled her to the bone. "Then," Jessica said slowly, "we'll have to make some difficult decisions about our living situation." Margaret understood the threat implicit in Jessica's words. If she didn't agree to sell them the house, they would make her life so miserable that she would be forced to leave. "I see," Margaret said, standing up from her chair. "So this is an ultimatum." "It's a reasonable business proposition," Michael corrected. "No, Michael," Margaret said sadly, "this is extortion. You're threatening to make my life difficult if I don't give you my house for half its value." "Mom," You're being dramatic, Michael said dismissively. Am I? Margaret asked. You've just told me that I need to sell you my home or face difficult decisions about the living situation. That sounds like a threat to me. Margaret looked at her son, the boy she had raised, the young man she had supported through college, the adult she had helped through his own financial difficulties. She barely recognized the person standing before her. I need you both to leave my house, Margaret said quietly. What? Michael was shocked. I need you to pack your things and leave. My house, Margaret repeated. Tonight. Mom, you can't be serious, Jessica said. I'm completely serious, Margaret replied. You've just threatened me in my own home. You've tried to manipulate me into selling you my property for half its value. You've shown me exactly what kind of people you are, and I don't want you in my house anymore. What happened next would shock Margaret to her core and reveal the true depths of her son's selfishness and entitlement. We left Margaret Thompson facing the prospect of a family meeting with her son Michael and daughter-in-law Jessica, who had been pressuring her to leave her own home following her job loss. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, the same room where she had celebrated Michael's graduation, where she had hosted family Christmas mornings, where she and David had spent countless quiet evenings together. Now, she was about to face her own son in what felt like a hostile negotiation. Mom, Michael began, his tone formal and cold. Jessica and I have been doing a lot of thinking about our situation here. Our situation? Margaret questioned. Yes, Jessica interjected. The living arrangement, the financial responsibilities, the future of this household. Margaret noticed how Jessica referred to it as this household rather than your home, as if Margaret were merely one resident among equals rather than the homeowner. We've realized, Michael continued, that this arrangement isn't working for anyone. I wasn't aware there was a problem, Margaret said carefully. Mom, there are several problems, Michael said, pulling out a piece of paper with what appeared to be a list. First, you're unemployed with no prospects for employment at your age. Margaret winced at the blunt assessment. Michael, I've been looking for work for only 5 weeks. Second, Jessica continued, you're becoming increasingly difficult to live with. Difficult? Margaret was shocked. In what way am I difficult? You're moody, you're stressed about money, and you're making everyone in this house walk on eggshells. Jessica explained. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. I'm stressed because I lost my job, which is a normal reaction. I haven't been moody or difficult. Mom, Michael said, you've been questioning our decisions about the house, objecting to our suggestions for improvements, and generally being resistant to change. This is my house, Margaret reminded them. I have every right to make decisions about my own property. Michael and Jessica exchanged a look that Margaret had seen many times over the past few weeks, a look that suggested they had discussed this conversation extensively and had prepared their arguments in advance. That brings us to our main point, Jessica said. We think it's time for you to consider moving out. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Moving out of my own home. Mom, Michael said, hear us out. You're 60 years old, unemployed, and struggling to maintain this big house. Jessica and I are established here, the kids are settled in their schools, and we can afford to take over the mortgage payments. Take over the mortgage payments. Margaret repeated. Michael, there's only $30,000 left on the mortgage. Exactly, Jessica said, which means we could easily afford to buy the house from you. Margaret began to understand the true nature of this family meeting. This wasn't about her well-being or finding a solution that worked for everyone. This was about Michael and Jessica wanting to acquire her house. Grandma Magiema said one afternoon, "Why does Mommy keep saying we might have to move?" Margaret's heart broke. "I don't know, sweetheart, we'll figure everything out." But Margaret was beginning to realize that her son and daughter-in-law had plans that didn't include her well-being. The woman who had sacrificed to help her family was about to discover just how little that sacrifice meant to them. The tension in the house continued to build as Margaret struggled with unemployment applications and job searches, while Michael and Jessica grew increasingly impatient with the uncertainty of their living situation. Little did Margaret know that the worst was yet to come, and that her son's true character was about to be revealed in the most shocking way possible. We left Margaret Thompson dealing with the shock of losing her job after 25 years, while her son, Michael, and daughter-in-law, Jessica, seemed more concerned about their own living situation than supporting her through this difficult time. The week following, Margaret's job loss was filled with uncomfortable conversations and growing tension. Margaret spent her days applying for jobs online, making phone calls to potential employers, and trying to remain optimistic despite the challenging job market for someone her age. Mrs. Thompson said one potential employer during a phone screening, "Your experience is impressive, but we're looking for someone who can grow with the company long term." Margaret understood the coded language. At 60 years old, she was considered too old for most positions, despite her decades of experience and proven track record. Meanwhile, Michael and Jessica's behavior became increasingly concerning. They held frequent private conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Margaret appeared. They began making changes to the house without consulting her, rearranging furniture, and even discussing renovation plans. "Mom," Michael said one evening, "Jessica and I have been thinking about remodeling the kitchen. It's pretty outdated." "Michael," Margaret replied carefully, "perhaps we should wait until I find employment before discussing major renovations." "But, Mom," Jessica interjected, "if we're going to be living here long term, we need to make the space work for our family." Margaret noticed the assumption in Jessica's words that they would be living there long term, as if Margaret's job loss had somehow transferred ownership of the house to them. Margaret said firmly, "This is still my home. Any major decisions about renovations will be made by me." Jessica's expression hardened. "Well, if you can't afford the house payments, maybe you shouldn't be making decisions about it." The comment stung Margaret deeply. She had never missed a mortgage payment in her life, and she had enough savings to cover several months of expenses while she looked for work. As the days passed, Margaret began to notice other changes in her family's behavior. Michael and Jessica started referring to various rooms as our bedroom, our living room, and the kids' playroom, as if Margaret were merely a tenant in her own home. Grandma Moggy Little Jake said one afternoon, "Daddy says this might be our house now." Margaret's heart sank. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Daddy says you might have to move to a smaller place because you don't have a job anymore," Jake explained innocently. Margaret realized that Michael and Jessica were already preparing the children for her departure. treating her unemployment as an opportunity to claim her home, rather than a family crisis requiring support and understanding. That evening, Margaret decided to have a serious conversation with her son. Michael, she said, we need to talk. Sure, Mom. What's on your mind? I'm concerned about some of the things you and Jessica have been saying about the house. Margaret began, this is my home, and I'm not planning to sell it or move out. Michael's expression grew defensive. Mom, be realistic. You're 60 years old and unemployed. How are you going to afford this place? I have savings, Michael, and I'm actively looking for work, Margaret replied. But what if you don't find a job? Michael pressed. What if your savings run out? Jessica and I can't support you financially. Margaret was hurt by her son's lack of confidence in her abilities. Michael, I've been managing my finances successfully for decades. I don't need you to support me. But, Mom, Jessica joined the conversation. You're not being practical. At your age, finding a job that pays enough to maintain this lifestyle is unrealistic. My lifestyle? Margaret questioned. Jessica, I live very modestly. This house is paid for except for a small remaining mortgage balance. Michael and Jessica exchanged a look that Margaret didn't understand. Mom, Michael said slowly, what do you mean the house is paid for? Margaret was confused by the question. I mean, your father and I paid off most of the mortgage before he died. I only owe about $30,000 on a house worth over $300,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael and Jessica stared at Margaret as if she had revealed a shocking secret. You only owe $30,000? Jessica asked. Yes, Margaret confirmed. Why are you both acting so surprised? Michael ran his hands through his hair. Mom, we thought you had a huge mortgage payment. We thought that's why you needed us to help with expenses. I never asked you to help with expenses, Margaret reminded them. You've been living here rent-free for 3 years because I wanted to help you save money. The realization seemed to hit Michael and Jessica simultaneously. They had been living in a nearly paid-off house, contributing nothing to the household expenses, while assuming Margaret was struggling financially. Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. If you enjoy our family drama stories that will shock you to your core, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes. Today I'm going to tell you a story that will leave you breathless, a story about a mother who was kicked out by her own son, only for him to discover a truth that changed everything. This story begins with Mrs. Margaret Thompson, a 60-year-old woman who lives in a beautiful suburban home in Ohio. Margaret is a widow who lost her husband David 5 years ago to cancer. She has one son, Michael, who is now 35 years old, married to Jessica, and they have 2 children, Emma, age 10, and Jake, age 8. Margaret worked as an executive assistant at a large corporation for 25 years. She was known for her dedication, her attention to detail, and her unwavering loyalty to the company. When David died, Margaret threw herself into her work even more, finding comfort in routine and purpose in her daily responsibilities. Mom, Michael would say, you work too hard. You should think about slowing down. Michael, dear, Margaret would reply, work keeps me busy. It helps me not think about missing your father. Margaret had always been proud of her son. Michael graduated from college with a business degree, found a good job at a marketing firm, and seemed to be building a stable life with Jessica. However, 3 years ago, Michael lost his job due to company downsizing. The family struggled financially, and Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Margaret said one evening, "I want you and your family to move in with me." "Mom, we can't ask you to do that," Michael replied. "You're not asking," Margaret said firmly. "I'm offering. This house is too big for just me, and you need a place to stay while you get back on your feet." Michael, Jessica, and the children moved into Margaret's 4-bedroom house. It was supposed to be temporary, just until Michael found another job and could afford his own place again. "We'll only stay for a few months," Jessica promised. "Just until we save enough money." But months turned into years. Michael did find work, but it paid less than his previous job. Instead of looking for their own place, the family settled into Margaret's house. Margaret didn't mind at first. She loved having her grandchildren around, and the house felt alive, again with family laughter and conversation. Grandma Maggie little Emma would say, "I love living here with you." "I love having you here too, sweetheart," Margaret would reply, hugging her granddaughter. But as time passed, Margaret began to notice changes in the family dynamic. Michael and Jessica started treating the house as if it were their own. They rearranged furniture, redecorated rooms, and made decisions about household matters without consulting Margaret. "Mom," Michael said one day, "Jessica and I think we should convert the basement into a playroom for the kids." "That's fine, dear," Margaret replied, "but perhaps we should discuss the budget first." "Don't worry about it," Michael said dismissively. "We'll handle everything." Margaret felt like she was becoming a guest in her own home, but she didn't want to cause conflict. She loved her family and wanted them to be comfortable. The situation became more complicated when Margaret's company began experiencing financial difficulties. There were rumors of layoffs, budget cuts, and restructuring. Margaret, despite her 25 years of service, began to worry about her job security. "David," she whispered to her late husband's photograph one evening, "I wish you were here to help me figure this out." Margaret's fears became reality on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Her supervisor, Mr. Peterson, called her into his office with a grim expression. "Margaret," he began, "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Due to the company's financial situation, we're going to have to let you go." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. "But, Mr. Peterson, I've been here for 25 years. My performance reviews have always been excellent." "I know, Margaret, and this isn't about your performance. It's purely a financial decision. We're eliminating several positions, and unfortunately, yours is one of them." "What about severance?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You'll receive 2 months severance pay and your accrued vacation time," Mr. Peterson explained. "I'm truly sorry, Margaret. If circumstances change, you'll be the first person we call." Margaret cleaned out her desk in a daze. 25 years of her life packed into a cardboard box. Colleagues offered sympathetic words and promises to stay in touch, but Margaret barely heard them. At 60 years old, finding another job would be nearly impossible. If you're enjoying this story, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. The drive home was the longest of Margaret's life. How would she tell Michael and Jessica? How would she pay her bills? What would happen to her family's living situation? When Margaret arrived home, she found Jessica in the kitchen preparing lunch for the children who were home from school with a snow day. "You're home early," Jessica observed. "Everything okay?" Margaret set down her box of belongings and took a deep breath. "I lost my job today." Jessica's expression changed immediately. "What do you mean you lost your job?" "The company is downsizing. They eliminated my position," Margaret explained. "Oh no," Jessica said, but her tone seemed more concerned than sympathetic. "What are you going to do?" "I'm not sure yet," Margaret admitted. "I'll start looking for another job. But at my age it might be challenging." When Michael came home that evening, Jessica had already told him the news. His reaction was not what Margaret expected. "Mom, this is a problem," Michael said bluntly. "How are you going to pay the mortgage and utilities?" "I have some savings," Margaret replied, "and I'll receive unemployment benefits while I look for work." "But for how long?" Michael pressed. "And what if you can't find another job?" Margaret was hurt by her son's lack of empathy. "Michael, I just lost my job today. Can we perhaps discuss this tomorrow when I've had time to process everything?" Moan. "We need to be practical," Michael continued. "Jessica and I have been talking, and we think you need to consider selling the house." "Selling the house?" Margaret was shocked. "This is my home, Michael. It's where your father and I built our life together." "But, Mom, you can't afford to keep it without a job," Jessica interjected. "And frankly, it's not fair to expect us to help pay for a house this size when we're trying to save money for our own place." Margaret stared at her daughter. "I never asked you to help pay for anything, Jessica." "Well, we can't just live here for free while you struggle to make payments," Jessica replied. "You've been living here for free for 3 years," Margaret pointed out quietly. The conversation grew more heated as the evening progressed. Michael and Jessica seemed more concerned about their own financial security than Margaret's. "Sutton, unemployment." "Mom," Michael said finally, "maybe it's time for you to think about downsizing. You could get a small apartment, and Jessica and I could take over the house payments." Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Take over the house payments?" "Michael, this is my house." "But if you can't afford the payments, double quotes," Michael began. "I never said I couldn't afford the payments," Margaret interrupted. "I said I lost my job today and need time to figure things out." The next few days were tense in the Thompson household. Margaret spent her time updating her resume and searching for job opportunities online, while Michael and Jessica whispered in corners and held hushed conversations that stopped whenever Margaret entered the room. Margaret began to feel unwelcome in her own home. The family she had opened her doors to was now treating her like a burden rather than the homeowner who had provided them shelter for 3 years.